Now, I know how many shiurim you've been dealing with in the last couple of hours, I assume. So I'm trying to, the kavana is trying to keep it shorter today, not to overburden you, overload you. But to make up for it, I'm going to try to talk about a topic which I think is maybe a little extra exciting or interesting. And that is that nowadays, after many years of raising awareness, there's a lot more awareness about the issue of children and abuse. Whether it's from a stranger, a relative, a person with authority, and a lot more thought going on about, so what does this mean for those who are the victims? What does it mean for those who are the perpetrators? So, and we hope that all the awareness has actually led to some kind of reduction in actual, incidents like these, or helping people who need help at a sooner moment. Okay. Now, of course, there are also halachic issues involved. And part of the raising awareness, the Shiur, had to do with the halachas involved as well. I personally, I could say that I remember that from my childhood till now, as a child, the general consensus was that al pi halacha, there's nothing much you can do. And by now, everyone, pretty much the consensus is that it's rodef, and you have to act accordingly. So, even taking very major steps. So that's something that's changed tremendously. So I'd like to discuss interesting exchange of tshuvas on this topic that appear in the Kovetz Migdal number 3 from Yeshiva Gedel Elchana in Los Angeles, printed in Tafshin Mem. Now, Tafshin Mem itself is pretty early, relatively speaking, but the tshuvas themselves, as we shall see, are from 1949. So very interesting. So page 94, we find the Shaila from Rav Goyen, Rav Dovid Yehuda Shachad Zal, the Rav of Basel, Hague, Toronto. The letter is dated Ches Mar Cheshvan Tafshin Yud, The Hague. Now, I'm sure everyone here, no one needs an introduction to the famous Shachat family, not to be confused with the Shuchat family, and the mark and the impact the Shachats have left in Chabad. But just to tell you a little bit of who their father was. So, in short, the father did not come from a Chabad background. In fact, he was from Telsha. He was related to one of the Gedolei HaMusar, Reb Simcha Zissel Ziv, who's known as the Alter of Kelm. And he was a Talmud Taka in the famous yeshiva in Tels. He was a Rav in Basel in Switzerland from 1930 to 1947, in The Hague in Holland from 1947, in the Netherlands from 1947 to 1952. And then afterwards, he was in Toronto, Rav in Toronto, till his passing in 1974. Now, for whatever reasons, his family were in a Askar to Chabad. I don't have to list all his important descendants. Many of them are in Chabad, some of them are not. Now, his son, Rav Ezer Shachar, is Rosh Yeshiva, of course, in Los Angeles. So when he printed this Kovetz, so he included this exchange of letters. Now, like I said, like I've been indicating, you could say this whole exchange is a bit ahead of its time. It feels that way. Because we know B'chlal, this discussion has different issues involved. L'mashal, there's it's famous now. There's a Children Tzemach Tzedek. It's become famous lately about the Rav who did something inappropriate. He touched the child inappropriately and he gave teretz. And Tzemach Tzedek, the approach that Tzemach Tzedek takes is just talking about what are the grounds for firing a Rav. How extreme does a Rav have to behave before you actually have grounds to fire him? That's how that tshuva goes. That's one discussion. We were discussing the tshuva when we were discussing religions, Christianity. So we mentioned there's a tshuva of the Re'im, the Mizrahi. Ask me afterwards. There's a tshuva of the Mizrahi who was asked about a shul. They caught a shamish doing something in the shul, and the shaila then was, what do we do with the shul? That was the question. But Rav Shachat, the father, he discusses two very pertinent points. Number one, are there people that essentially this is who they are? It's a sort of orientation that they have, and there's nothing to talk about, and we have to work with that assumption. And number two, if you have someone like this, can we characterize them as a rodef? So we'll start with this question. Now, his son, Rabbi Shachar, has a lot of aris on the bottom. Anyone who's interested in these topics wants to delve into it, is more than welcome to look it up. It's an Eitzir Chachma. So, the shaila is dated Ches Cheshvan Tafshin Yud, The Hague. He says, I have the shaila about an individual. The way he writes it is Netias Hamin Etzloi Eino Tivis. Doesn't have a natural orientation. He's done many teyevis with children. He's been arrested, and he always is right back at it. According to the doctors, there's no hope. And in this situation, he's a takal rabim, he's a public menace, and he himself is suffering. So they're saying, when you internet comments, whenever someone gets caught, they say, be Messiahsim. So that's what they're talking about. The authorities were saying, let's do castration. And the guy himself agrees, and he's begging that you should do it because, he's totally out of control. And the chief doctor of the non-Jewish hospital reached out to the rabbi with this question to, what does the Jewish law have to say about it? Now, obviously, we're talking about a person like this. We have to distinguish. There are different levels in this problem. Obviously, you'll have people that are married and are more or less running a functional life, and maybe if you're able to warn them and set their lives up in a way where they don't come in contact, and maybe they can actually live in control of it. But here we're clearly talking about someone who's a lot far gone than that, is socially clearly not a very well person. So that's what we're talking about here. So the Dovid Shraga raises 3 points. He says, number one, can we characterize him as a sadis b'idei shamayim? That's him, he can't have children because he doesn't have a normal netiya, so he's not marriage material. So you can equate him to a zaken. A zaken also is not going to have children, and this guy, it's never going to happen. So, and this is Sugya in Gemara Shabbos, stuff Kuf Yud Aleph, is according to the Achreinim. In a case where the person's already a sadis b'idei shamayim, there's no iser sirus acher sirus. So whatever you're doing to this person now afterwards, he's already a sadis b'idei shamayim. This is a shut of the Chassam Sefer. Can't really, I don't know if you can get into. The Shaila was someone that had some kind of growth in that area, and it was Goydel Kikar Lechem, and they cut it out. And the question was, is he now a Ptsuadaka, Krushavcha? This discussion, this is the kind of discussion you actually find a lot of in the generations throughout the centuries, especially when medicine started modernizing a bit. It's one of the big topics. Yaakov Emden has a lot to say about it. It was a big topic. And the question being what the mitzvah, often this was a question of the halacha versus mitzvahs. When is a person actually unable to have children, after which procedures? So the Chassam Sefer is trying to establish that this person, because it was done for refuah, so he wants to establish that doesn't have a din psuadaka, and he's mutter lover bakol, he can be married or stay married. So he quotes the smag that says that the whole psul is only when it was bidei adam al yidei pshiyasai. So he says, bazai dafka b'pshiyah, but if it's the refuah, then the person's not psuadaka, he's mutter bakol. What about the Gemara about misaris acher misaris? So he says either that's a different, even if there is an issue of Masaras Achar Masaras, maybe that's a different Isser. Right now we're talking about Psuadaka, Mutter Love Bakal. Maybe there's a separate Isser talking Masaras Achar Masaras. Or he says it could be no, Imas Chala Haya B'dei Shemayim. This part that if the Chala is B'dei Shemayim, then when you do afterwards, it's already not a problem. So if we could take this word of Chassam Sefer, even though Shulchan Aruch doesn't say this, or Dovid Shraga says, maybe we're going to say, look, an old person, of course, literally, physically, is unable to have children. His body is such that it's impossible. Whereas here, the person's body is fully functioning. It's a netiya. Right? So it's a bit of a modern question to distinguish that the person has a netiya that makes him unable to have children. That was his first question. His first point. The second point is, can we consider this person a rodef? Because the guy has a reputation, he's consistent, and he's kamat, not a bal bechira, he says. And according to expert doctors, he's not even really a kipikeach l'chol dvarav. So maybe we can call him a rodef achar hazachar, which was one of the cases, Taka. So that's another point he raises. And then he raises a third point, which is that frame I lost. Here. Sorry.
If you consider rodef,
if there's a rodef, mutter latziloi be'achad me'ivarav. That's the basic din of a rodef. So that would be the din he's trying to invoke here. That's achad me'ivarav. And the third point he raises is that there's a concept in Gemara about drinking a kais shel ikrin l'refuah. And it says the Tosfos in that Sugya in Shabbos that says that really it's only a matter of psikration. You drink it, and then as a side effect, the person becomes unable to have children. So he says, well, maybe you could say that here it's Amir La'akum. So Amir La'akum, Sikresha, Shari. He says, no, because drinking is a little more indirect. Here, they're being Masadas to be a dime. Not only that, over there, you're drinking for one reason, and the side effect is something else. Here, the whole kavanah is to be mevat mimenu kayach hamin. So what are you going to say is a psikresh over here? You don't want to stop him from having children. You want to stop him from chasing the children. But so can you really distinguish between those two things, or it's levat mimenu kayach hamin? So can you really call it a davar she'ein miskaven here? Psikresha. Raises another point that maybe we can be makel from the fact that the doctors are going to do it themselves. Let's just not intervene. That's another svara he raises. So he received 3 tshuvas that we see here from Gedolei Doirei. 2 are short and 1 are long. I'll start with the short ones. First one is Reb Zelig Reuven Bengis, was a Rav in Lita. Then he went to Yerushalayim. He was one of the Chashvei Rabbanim in Yerushalayim. He passed away in Tafshin Yud Gimel. So it's a few weeks later, that month, Chav Gimel Cheshvan, he writes to Ben Gissi. Why is he Ben Gissi? Because Reb Zelig Reuven's wife was also a Ziv, and her sister was the mother of Dovid the Shachat. So that's Ben Gissi. Says, so we're going to see 3, besides the different perspectives, we're going to see 3 fundamental just views of the world in these 3 chuvas. So Reb Zelig Reuven responds and says, regarding your strange question, I'm pretty sure that no one who's ever been Isaac Potato has ever discussed this before, and it's not mentioned in Gemara, so I don't see how we can just start discussing Savaris and to be Mater and Isser, where even Groma you're not allowed. And we have Shoinim that say even a Ben Noach is Mitzvah Midin Torah. He says, Haytachen, you sure? You can't just sit down and have a conversation with this guy? Sit down with him, explain to him that he has to behave like a normal mensch, and, marry him off, and, they'll help him settle down. And then he throws in a vert, he says, and even if he marries a woman, Gamim Azul Basar Ibcha, which is his way of saying, even if he's does like a darka, and in his mind, the Zelig Reuven say, okay, this guy likes behaving like this, so he can do it with his wife. He boggles his mind that the person wouldn't be equally happy to, be with his wife. So Zelig Reuven just fully is not, Zelig Reuven Bengis, of Yerushalayim. Pastor Tafshin Yud Gimel. So that's that. So that's his reaction to that. What about a rodef? He says, come on, we all know that a rodef is only ba'is hashah. When he's literally chasing someone, then he's a rodef, then you be matzil bechad me'yavarav. Well, it says in Rambam, if he already did the act, you can't shoot him, you can't kill him after he completed the act, then you take him to Beis Din. So Mistamit also before the act, you can't do anything, you can't preemptively, that's his response to that.
Be on guard.
Okay, so that's your responsibility, be on guard. You're doing something to him, he's not a rodef now.
Ready to roll.
Yeah. So he says, Lafidaiti, there's no suffix here, they could be matter this, and if the goyim do it, so that's al cheshboin of achar yusam, so he's giving a little room for them to just let them do whatever they want, but certainly not to give our agreement. And he says, Hashem shel yatzilenu mishgiyos, which is a lashon in Shuvas, and he adds, v'yatzel gamas elome mishigoinus v'shigyoinus. He's a little bewildered by this whole question. So that's Reb Zelig Reuven's reaction to that. The second response is from Reb Elia Meir Bloch of Telz. His father was Reb Yosef Leib Bloch, who was the famous Rosh Yeshiva back in Telz in Lita, the author of Shiur Das, which Derech Agav quote from Chassidus. And that's where Dovid the Shachat had learned. And so the son, Reb Elia Meir Bloch, was the one who came to America and founded the Yeshiva of Telz, Cleveland. So he's presumably there already. Came, I think, earlier in the decade. So he also responds from Archesh and Tafshin Yud. I'm going to get your question. Interestingly, completely the opposite. Yafa done. Shedinoi kedin hazaken. Great. Yeah, you want to say he's like a zaken, he's not royal oiled. Perfect. if it's true that they're not royal lahayla, which what exactly does that mean? But if it's true that they can't to be moiled, and it doesn't matter where the chulsha is, as long as it's not possible. That also makes a lot of sense. He's fully on board, agreeable, not much resistance, not much comment. The last point gets him a little more interested. That you want to say miskaven, not miskaven, that the result is a she'ena miskaven. He says, no, of course, the whole kavana here, you're coming in for a procedure to be mistaris. You can't say that's a side effect. And he starts discussing Yonim like this. He mentions that Bishul Diskin has a shaila about, are you allowed to put yourself in a situation where you're going to end up having to be Mechal Shabbos later? And Bishul Diskin said that you're allowed to. You're allowed to go on the road before Shabbos, even though ultimately you can eat the Chol Shabbos, because Chayav the Shabbos wasn't Chal yet. You said Elya Meir is commenting on this. And but then there's a raya for carrot, because it says you're not to sell yourself to a guy who's then going to force you to do dvarim ha'asurim. What's the difference right now? So Elimir says I don't see the comparison. Shabbos, you're not going to be Mechal Shabbos. You're going to do whatever. The Chil Shabbos is something that happens later. When you sell yourself, it's more or less understood and implicit and agreed that you're volunteering. You're selling yourself to do the following list of malachas, which include Dvarim Asurim, so he doesn't see a comparison. That was his Ha'ara. Otherwise, he seems to be fully on board with everything else that Rabbi the Shachat said. Now we get to the third one. The third one, which is the longest one, is written by Rav Isaac Herzog, the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, and you could say he's a bit in the middle between the two responses. As far as I know, this shuvah is not printed in any other collection of his shuvahs. I haven't even seen that anyone who's discussed this sugya has been mitzayin to this whole exchange. No, that was Pesach Frank. I don't remember offhand. So Rabbi Isaac Herzog, he writes a bit later. He's writing at the end of Kislev, and he says, I just got your letter from Tesmar Cheshvan a few days ago. I'm not sure why it was delayed. He says, so this has like 11 isyas. We're going to make a quick shortcut through them. He says, first of all, I'm not a doctor. All I know is a little bit I read here and there. Of course, he was a very widely read individual. We know he did a PhD on Tcheles, so definitely a more worldly and widely read individual. But you say, I'm not going to claim to be any expertise on the subject. Now, you're saying, so you're telling me that he has no attraction just to this. So he's not real loyal. He says, I don't know if that could be even a sniff, lahakal. Because the zaken, of course, is any royal batsam, as you yourself said. Zaken, his body, it's not possible. Here, the Evra Halad are fine. It's a machlo nafshis psichis. He has a psychic problem. Psychiatric problem. But in fact, for carrot, I'll say mimanavshach. If the machla has a refuah, if there's some kind of hope for someone like this, so then you can't say he's ain't royal lohailid. There's a solution. And if there's no refuah, so he's even worse than a zaken. So the Gemara itself should have mentioned it. The Gemara was trying to figure out what's the case you're allowed to drink a kresh liquid, and the Gemara should have said this. He's a guy who was and or there's no din nefashis, and the doctors came and said that he has a machlop psichis. The Gemara should have said this whole thing. It's not in the Gemara, so that's his response. Now, interestingly, Reza Shachar comments in the bottom. Where does this assumption come from? Why is Isaac Herzog assuming that? One of the things he said was maybe that itself was grounds for acquittal. So he asks on Isaac Herzog, where do you got this from? You have someone who is it says in Rambam, someone who's very sick. He's infatuated with Arias. The only solution is that you should give him what he wants. So we say he's not allowed to, and if he does, so he says, sounds like, and that's pretty messed up. The guy sounds pretty sick. So yet we're treating him But it's interesting. I did mention to some of you this year that discussion came up. Well, how does Torah view temporary insanity defense? And as I mentioned, there's a Maratz Chayes, Tzvir Chayes, and it's a Goyes and Gemara Sanhedrin. It's the famous Gemara about Sanhedrin that said that all the Sanhedrin said the guy's Chayev. Why is he freed? So Maratz Chayes says that in every case there's always some far-fetched defense. Leimor, ulay lehaya sichlei butter uvechasar deya. So he eno pulase mishpat maves v'chadaymer. So Maratz Chayes is right that this would be a defense that the guy was insane, temporarily insane. V'chadaymer shar hisnatzliyas v'chaykas. He's calling them far-fetched, but those are the defenses you hear. He says, and now we see today in France and Britain, you get a public defender. You automatically get a public defender to defend you no matter how heinous the crime you committed is. He says, in other countries, in Eastern Europe, they didn't have a public defender, but it was sort of the judge's job. The judge had to play devil's advocate. There was, of course, a state prosecutor, and the judge is the one pushing back a little bit. So he says that's what Sanhedrin's job is here. If no one in Sanhedrin is able to muster a good defense, so it looks like Sanhedrin isn't doing a good job here, so that's the reason why it's no good. Of course, you don't want that to happen, and that everyone should find them chayav, and then they all get acquitted. So you want someone who is a good lawyer, it's an agent who can put up a defense just for he himself says, he doesn't actually, we don't actually want these defenses to work, but someone at least to claim it, to plead it. So he seems to be suggesting there is such a concept, even though it doesn't necessarily seem to be fully endorsing it. The Rebbe actually mentions this in the Kisisa Tafshim Hey, when the Rebbe spoke about this Gemara, and it's a Likun Kutasichas. So the Rebbe actually mentions this Pshat and Maratz Chayes. Probably the Rebbe didn't mention Pratim, but that there's a word that the Sanhedrin is no good. And the Rebbe said, no, you can't say that. We need a Hezber where Sanhedrin come out sounding great. But stop, Derech Hagav. So Rabbi Zakaria is saying, why didn't the Gemara say that? Oh, that's the case of Kais Ikrin. That was Gemara's question. It seems that it's mutter. When is it mutter? So why didn't it say this? So then he goes on to say that so that's he's not accepting that, right? What about the rodef? So he agrees with Rav Bengas. He says that say a rodef, but you're chasing a certain person, and that moment while he's chasing, well, like this. Where did we ever hear of this being a rodef? That he's just an ongoing threat? Amy Kanraya. Ois Gimel, here he agrees with Rav Bloch that the idea of Miskav, and he's not Miskav, he's Miskav and Refuah. Come on, of course, your kavanah here is to be Misaris. So, but in Ois Dal, he comes up with a whole different approach. He says, it says in the Gemara Gittin that if there's a master that has a Chatzi Shifcha, so because she can't settle down, and Mamela, people are treating her hefker. So it's a problem for society that someone's being machshel people. So we force them to be mashacher her. And to say that she's actually the one that's being mishadol, and the other people are almost like anusim. Who can stand in her way? She's so determined. So for that reason, we tell him he can do an avera to be mishacher the shifcha. You can compare this to that here. The children are like the people that are krevim la'anusim in these avedas. So maybe we should do an iser lav right now to save many from all these avedas. We don't usually say chatoi b'shvil sheyiska chaytei, but over here it's first of all he's an honest himself, so maybe you're taka you are. It is kedai to say sheyiska him he himself, and also it's lahatz la'chayim. Then he goes, he starts getting into a whole detailed discussion about how does it work, what is nitchem and pneima. We're not getting into all of that, but in the end, he mentions that there's a tshuva from the Goyen of Kovner, Yitzchak Khan Inspector, and Be'er Yitzchak. So the shaila there was about a heter meinekas. There was a soldier, one of the Jewish soldiers, left behind the Minekas, and there was another soldier who was willing to take care of her, but only up to now that he can marry her now. Otherwise, he's going to wait for 24 months to marry her. He's not taking care of her. And the Bazoi, she might go off the derech. It was a whole situation. And Rabbi Tzadok Khan Taka paskind that lakula. So So the part of the vart is that the Bitzuk Chanan says that you can be over in Chil Shabbos mishum savik mitzvah derabim. It's Eidei HaChodesh. You want to be made on the Levana, so the Mechal Shabbos, even though it's a suffix. He says, fine, even if that's true, but that's a mitzvah derabim for Klal Yisrael. Maybe saving a bunch of Yechidim from Averis here isn't quite the same thing. So it's not so simple. Then he starts asking, first of all, who b'chal are the victims here? He says, are the victims Yisrael or not Yisrael? Maybe that makes a difference here. If it's b'chal not a very Jewish society, and the chance that it's going to be machti yalda Yisrael, then maybe you can't compare it to the Gemara in Gittin. That's another point he makes. Another point is, which is also an issue we used to hear. If it's only b'liladim ketanim, is it really an avera here? Is he really doing it apitayra? Is he really doing anything to the children? Are they really being nichshel in anything? So also, it has to be matzel, people from Echemina Chet. What's the hatzala over here? And it's b'chlal chakira and achreinim. Do children have averas? We just don't punish them, or it's b'chlal not a din avera? As I'm saying again to Bitzuk Chanan and Nachal Yitzchak and Chayshim Mishpat, who gets into this discussion there as well. Then it gets back to the previous point about Chayshish L'miyot, even if mostly Goyim here, but maybe down the road it can affect Yidden. And it's a whole discussion of how do you measure the side is the likelihood of the Avera happening versus the severity of the Avera versus the severity of what you're doing now to prevent the Avera from happening. So it's a bit of a tricky calculus. But in this case, he says, I'm just going to try to finish off here. He says, in this case, we should say, who's doing the Avera here? He's doing the Avera. We're not doing an Avera for him. He's doing the Avera himself, maybe. And he's an anus. And we see in Shulchan Aruch, Shem Yitzrei Misgaber Olav, Nida, Eshezish, so you can be Meizer Shech Vazar, Alavatala. So that's a lesser Avera in order to be saved from the harsher Avera. So Bazoi, here he's not even doing anything. And who says B'chlal? He's over by Makif and Nikov. So there's an Avera for the person, to the person who's involved passively is also over. But who says by Asaris, the person who's involved, is over, and you're going to say he's a Messiah. He's not. When's he Messiah? He's unconscious. Not chloroform. He's lying Kevin Diamond. So so that's that point that he makes. One additional point he makes is that what about talking about Siros? Fine. Let's say we got around that. What about Bittul Mitzvahs Periverivia? That's a whole other question, and that's Deiraisa. He's mamish being mevatel a mitzvah Deiraisa. Anyway, ultimately his maskana was, we don't have time. So ultimately his maskana was that the Jewish community, when it's asked, should say they're not getting involved. And the person himself who needs to sign on the agreement, so they should get some representative, non-Jewish representative in the hospital to sign for him. And they should get a non-Jewish doctor to do it. But he agreed, tachlis, to do this halacha l'maisa, b'yiratzin, that we shouldn't hear about this again, we shouldn't need these types of kulas. And if there's a better way to do it, more indirect, shtiyas kois ikrin, or zrikois, maybe that would be better, but it sounds like you don't have that option. That was Rabbi Isaac Herzog's maskana. Of course, we only touch very briefly on all kinds of deep halachic discussions here, but just to give you a sense of the discussion. Just one final interesting point. All the way in the beginning, Rabbi Shraga has a long R 5 in response to those who said that it's not a rodef because right now he's not chasing anyone. He said, what about all the halachas about a meiser? We see that a meiser, right? It's attacking Gemara, Rambam. We don't find this concept of a person who's a serial problem. We only treat one case at a time. But later on in Rishonim, we see that they did treat someone who was a master or something like that, or who was doing extremely illegal activities that could be a threat for the whole community. They did treat them as a rodef. So, and that is taka, this Yisod that he mentions here in Tafshin Mem, is taka Yisod that many Rabbanim have invoked today to say, yeah, there is such a concept of rodef, you don't have to stick to that concept from Gemara. Interestingly, he connects it also to current events, current then, current now. Masu matin ma'arvim. He says, Huchsuku kvar yesem gimel pa'amim. They have a din reitfim, so he throws it in with bold print, bold type to make a statement about that. So this is the kind of topic that probably needs a part two, but as is customary here, we don't usually follow with a part two. So we'll leave it. Azoi, Shabbos, and a good Chodesh.